Bonjour, this is Mr. Kays, and we're talking today about 20.3, Atlantic Slave Trade and the Evolution of African Slavery. We're looking at the idea of slavery in general. Muslim and African slavery allowed some legal rights and some social mobility. We see slaves in Africa or in Muslim countries like Arabia work their way up to become generals, businessmen. They could own their own property. Slavery wasn't necessarily the end of your life. You were a slave only for a certain part of time, and if you had any children born to you, they were not slaves. That's going to be different in European slavery, and we're going to talk about that down the way here. The desire for Africans. Africans were a desirable alternative to Native Americans who were dying off because of white folks' diseases. Africans were less immune, or more immune to European diseases. They were farmers. Africans had experienced farming, and guess what they're going to do over in the Americas? They're going to farm. They're less likely to escape, and why is that? It's because they don't know their way around. They know they were on the high seas for a couple weeks, and it wasn't going to be likely they were ever going to find their way back, so they were kind of resigned to the fact they were slaves. And the fact that their skin color was dark made it easier to catch runaways. Hey, that guy is black-skinned, and he's running away. He's got to be a slave. So it lended itself quite nicely for the Europeans to make slaves the alternative to Indians as a labor source. The African slave trade, buying and selling of Africans as slaves for work in the Americas. Now, of course, Spain and Portugal are going to lead the way because they are seagoing people. They live on the Iberian Peninsula. They are their front doors the Atlantic, their back doors the Mediterranean. They are explorers, and as they went down the west coast of Africa and then finally to the east coast of Africa, they're going to be slavers. So you can put down they import slaves to South and North America and the Caribbean, Caribbean, for plantation labor and for mines, mines, harvesting or mining gold and silver. Now, statistic here, 40% of the slaves in the 1600s came from Africa. 40% of the population were slaves from Africa. All right, slavery is going to spread throughout the Americas. In the 1700s, England is going to dominate the slave trade. They even eclipse the Portuguese and the Spanish. So they're hogs. They dominate the slave trade. It's not until the early 1800s that they do away with slavery in general. But in the 1700s, they are the ones that dominate the slave trade. African cooperation and resistance. Native tribes fought each other to enslave and trade slaves to the Europeans. Europeans did not go into the interior. They made a deal with an African tribe to fill these leg irons or these handcuffs with so many slaves, and they gave them weapons. So native tribes bumped off other native tribes that they hated. They enslaved them and got rid of them. So their enemies didn't necessarily get killed, they got enslaved by the Europeans. Now, the triangular trade. Africa, the second leg was the New World, the Americas, and then Europe, that's the third leg. They trade slaves, raw materials, and finished goods. And I'm going to show you in a second here with a map. Here's the triangular trade. Now, you're going to see different types of the triangular trade, but here's the most common. Finished goods from Europe go down to Africa, like rum, like knives, like trinkets. They're traded for Africans. The Africans come over to the New World. They are a labor source. They harvest the crops. Those raw materials go back to Europe to be made into finished goods and back down through. So slaves go over to the Africas or to the Americas. Sugar is harvested. It's made into rum. The rum is taken down to Africa, traded for slaves, etc., etc. There's the triangular trade. Let me just back up for a second. The Middle Passage is from Africa to the New World. That's the Middle Passage. It's a voyage from Africa to the Americas. It's the middle leg of the triangular trade. And that journey is where white slavers would pack blacks into the cargo holds, maybe 350 in the cargo hold that would comfortably accommodate 200. Well, why did they pack them in so tight? Knowing they would die along the way, 10% of them, they just throw them overboard. It meant more profit for the slave ships and the slave captains. They were paid by the head. Okay, a harsh life. As they came over on the ships, they would be auctioned off at the ports. They would be taken to the plantations where they would be worked very hard, fed very little, and hereditary slavery. That meant if you were a slave, so were your children. It was passed down from generation to generation. So there was no escape from slavery per se. Resistance and rebellion. Slaves at times would fight back by slowing down their work, burning down tool sheds or barns, and then they would also run away. That was how they resisted. At times you would also have slave rebellions, and they continued well into the 1800s, where slaves would rise up and kill their masters or whites, and if the slaves were caught, they were executed. That happened well into the 1800s. What are the consequences of the Atlantic slave trade? Well, one is culture was lost in Africa. Tribes just disappeared. Societies disappeared. And there was that strong labor that was gone in Africa. Number two, guns were introduced to Africa. It was disastrous for African tribes. Number three, countries grew with slave labor. They ran with slave labor, like the American South. And then finally, we do see some good things. African art, music, religion, and food influenced the Americas. The Africans may have come with nothing but the clothes on their back, but they brought with them art, music, religion, food. They're going to influence the Americas. So, this is Monsieur K's signing off. 20.3 is in the books. We out. Let me get out here. Let me get out. Right. Quit laughing.